The Gulf of Mexico sprawled beneath a June sun in 1973, a vast, glassy green sheet rippling to the horizon. 50 miles off Louisiana's coast, the oil-rigged Pelican Dawn hulkied over the water, its steel legs stabbed deep into the unseen silt. Jack Rusty Callahan stood on the dive deck, salt and diesel stinging his lungs, his bulky suit creaking as he cinched the helmet seals. At 38, he was too worn for this. Knees aching, back a tangle of scars from his Navy years, but the paycheck kept him tethered. That, and the deep's quiet, where the past couldn't claw at him. Storm ripped up leg 3, Reese growled, his voice a rough drawl cutting through the rig's din. The boss was a wiry man, skin cracked red from the sun, a cigarette smoldering as he waved a clipboard. Need you down there, Rusty. Check the welds, make sure she don't give. Can't afford her foldin' now. Rusty spat tobacco over the rail, the dark fleck vanishing into the swell. Shoulda sent me for it hit. Ain't my fault you dragged your feet. Reese's eyes sharpened, but he held his tongue. Rusty was their top diver, ex-Navy, honed on wrecks in lightless seas. He'd lost his brother Vince to a dive gone sour in '68, a hush job off Guam, and the Gulf was as near as he got to chasing that echo. Reese knew it, worked it. Just get it done, he said, turning off. 200 feet. In and out. The crew hovered nearby, roughnecks in grimed coveralls, their faces taut. They'd been off since the storm. 3 days of screaming wind and waves that bucked the rig like a cork. Night shifts swore they'd seen lights in the water, faint flashes that weren't rig glow or trawlers. Spirits, one kid mumbled, tracing a cross on his chest. Or Red's testin' something. Rusty let it slide. Men got antsy out here, cage too long. He'd heard taller tales over shots in Homa, ships lost, divers rattled by shadows. The Gulf swallowed stories like it did souls. He stepped into the dive cage, a battered box tight around his frame, and jerked his chin. The winch whined, lowering him over the edge. The sea rushed up, cold and black, the rig's floodlights smearing into a murky green as he sank. His headset fizzed, Reese's voice flickering through. Keep it sharp, Callahan. Weather's tinnin' again. Rusty didn't answer. He loathed the noise, the tether line yanking like a noose. Down here, it was just him in the dark. At 50 feet, the light thinned, the Gulf's currents tugging his suit. Bubbles streamed from his regulator, curling up like faint phantoms. 100 feet, and the rig leg loomed, a crusted spine fading into the abyss. He snapped on his dive light, the beam slicing a weak path through the haze. The welds looked firm, but a raw crack jagged up from the base, storm damage Reese hadn't oversold. He'd need to patch it quick. Then he saw it. A faint glow, emerald and pulsing, blinked beyond the leg, maybe 30 yards out. Not rig lights, not the shimmer of shrimp or jellies. This was steady, alive, like a heartbeat in the black. Rusty's gut clenched. He dived wrecks, pipelines, even a down bomber once, but nothing glowed like that. Reese, he rasped into the mic. You catchin' this on sonar? Static screeched back, sharp enough to jab his ears. Say again, Callahan? Reese's voice was a wisp, torn by interference. Rusty slapped the headset. Dead hiss. He checked his depth, 180 feet and dropping. The tether slackened, the winch must have slipped. He should have signaled up, but that glow snagged him, a pull he couldn't shake. Kicking free of the cage, he drifted toward it, the rig leg blurring behind. The water thickened, heavy with silt, his light bouncing off flecks like ash in a squall. 200 feet now, his suit's edge, but the glow solidified real. His pulse thumped, louder than the regulator's wheeze. Whatever it was, it didn't fit down here. At 20 yards, it took form. A dome massive, maybe 50 feet wide, crouched on the seafloor. Its surface gleamed slick and black, like wet rock catching light it shouldn't. The green pulse seeped from within, leaking through cracks or seams he couldn't pin. Rusty hovered, weightless, his beam trembling as he aimed it. No growth, no rust, just that smooth, wrong curve. His mind churned. Wreckage? Some Navy rig? But the Navy didn't shape like this, and no wreck breathed. Reese, he tried again, voice rough. You hearin' me? There's something down here. The static surged, a wall of noise burying his words. He glanced at his oxygen gauge, 40 minutes left, but the needle twitched unsteady. Then the hum hit, low and deep, rippling through the water, up his suit into his bones. Not a sound, more a weight, like the Gulf was stirring. He edged closer, 10 yards now, the dome filling his sight. Up close, it wasn't just sleek. Faint lines etched its surface, hard angles like marks he'd glimpsed on old charts in port dives. The glow quickened, syncing with the hum, and Rusty's skin prickled under the rubber. He'd felt this once, off Guam when Vince's sub went silent, dread, cold and sharp, whispering turn back. But he didn't. Couldn't. Not with this facing him. 5 yards out, his light caught a seam, a split in the dome's sweep, spilling that green shimmer. The hum spiked, jarring his teeth, and the water shifted, a current with no cause. Rusty froze, breath snagging. He wasn't alone. Something was here, and it wasn't the crew's spirits or Soviet toys. It was older, stranger, and it sensed him too. The dome loomed, mute but alive, and Rusty's hand gripped his dive knife, useless as it was. He'd found something no one was meant to see, and the Gulf wasn't letting him off easy. Rusty Callahan hung in the Gulf's black embrace, 5 yards from the dome, his dive light trembling against its slick, obsidian curve. The green glow pulsed faster now, spilling from that seam like a wound-bleeding light, and the hum burrowed deeper. Past his suit, into his chest, a vibration that shook his ribs. His regulator hissed steady, but his breath felt tight, ragged, like the water itself was pressing in. 200 feet down, alone, tethered to a rig that couldn't hear him, he should have been hauling back. But the dome held him, a magnet he couldn't shake. He thumbed the mic again. "Reese, you there? Something's alive down here." The headset screamed static, a jagged wall of noise that clawed his ears. He winced, yanking the cord, nothing. The rig was deaf, or he was. His light flickered, the beam stuttering across the dome's surface, catching those strange, angular marks. They weren't scratches, too deliberate, like cuts from a tool he didn't know. His pulse kicked harder, drowning the hum for a split second. He'd seen wrecks, subs, even a rusted prop plane off Biloxi, but this wasn't man-made. Not any man he'd met. The water shifted again, a slow swirl brushing his suit. Rusty swung his light, scanning the murk, nothing but silt and shadow. Then movement, sharp and quick, darted at the dome's edge. He froze, beam snapping back. There, below the seam, where the glow spilled thickest, figures. Sleek, humanoid, no taller than kids, maybe 4 feet, gliding through the water. Their suits shimmered, tight and silver, catching the green light like oil on a puddle. No bubbles, no gear, just smooth, uncanny motion, too fast for the Gulf's drag. "Jesus," he muttered, the word fogging his helmet. His light jittered as he tracked them, 3, maybe 4, circling the dome's base. They moved with purpose, darting in and out of the glow, their limbs bending wrong, too fluid. His gut screamed surface now, but his hands stayed locked, knife useless at his hip. He'd faced sharks, barracuda, even a tangle with a moray once, but these weren't fish. Weren't human. One paused mid-motion and turned. Its head tilted, slow and deliberate, and Rusty's breath caught. No face, just a blank, reflective mask, mirror-smooth, throwing back his own light. It saw him. Not just noticed, saw. The hum spiked, a jolt that rattled his teeth, and his light died, snuffed out, leaving only the dome's glow. Darkness clawed in, the green pulse his only anchor. He fumbled the switch, nothing. Dead. "Reese," he barked, voice cracking. Static roared back, louder, shredding the line. His oxygen gauge spun wild, needle bouncing. 40 minutes left, then 20, then pegged at 0. Bullshit, he'd checked it topside. The suit's seals groaned, pressure shifting, like the deep was squeezing tighter. Panic clawed up his throat, but he choked it down. He'd trained for this. Gear fails, you adapt. But this wasn't failure. This was sabotage. The figure moved closer, gliding upward, its mask a void staring through him. The others stopped, heads swiveling in sync, locking on. The hum turned guttural, a growl he felt in his spine, and the water thrummed, waves of it pulsing from the dome. Rusty kicked back, instinct overriding shock, his boots churning silt. 10 yards, 15, the glow dimmed, but the hum chased him, burrowing into his skull. His tether line jerked, taut again, the winch alive or the rig crew finally waking up. He didn't care which. Another figure darted, cutting across his path. Too fast, too close. Its arms stretched, long and thin, brushing the tether. A spark flared, blue-white, and the line sagged, frayed ends floating free. Cut. Rusty's heart slammed his ribs. No tether, no comms, gear failing. He was loose in the deep with them. The first figure loomed nearer, mask glinting, and the hum became a shriek, piercing his head like a drill. He kicked harder, upward, the dome shrinking below. The green glow flickered, weaker, but the figures followed, shadows in the murk, their motions a silent hunt. His gauge steadied, 30 minutes, real this time, but the suit felt wrong, heavy, like it was dragging him down. The hum softened, then sharpened, a rhythm he couldn't place, almost words. Stay. Look. No. He shook it off. Hallucination, nitrogen narcosis, anything but real. He'd seen Vince's log once, scribbled before that last dive. It talks down there. He'd laughed it off then. Not now. 150 feet. The rig's floodlights pierced the haze, faint but growing. The figures slowed, hovering at the edge of the glow, their masks catching the last of it. Watching. Rusty's lungs burned, his kicks sloppy, but he kept going. 100 feet. The hum faded, a dull ache lingering in his bones. 50 feet. The cage loomed, swaying empty, a lifeline he didn't trust anymore. He broke the surface, gasping, the gulf spitting him out. Hands grabbed his suit, rig crew shouting, hauling him onto the deck. The air hit cold, the sun too bright, and Rusty ripped off his helmet, sucking breath. Faces stared down, Reese, the kid with the cross, a dozen others, pale, silent, eyes wide like they'd seen a ghost. His gear clattered, dripping, the severed tether coiled like a snake. No one asked. They didn't need to. Rusty slumped against the rail, the hum still echoing in his skull, faint but there. Below, the gulf lapped quiet, hiding what he'd seen. What had seen him? He'd made it up. But he knew, staring at those faces, that down there, something wasn't done with him yet. Rusty Callahan slumped against the rail of Pelican Dawn, the Gulf's salt air biting his lungs as he gulped it down. His dive suit dripped, pooling black water on the deck, the severed tether coiled beside him like a dead thing. The crew circled, faces pale under the rig's harsh lights. Reese, the kid with the cross, a wiry welder named Mac. All staring, mouths shut tight. The silence was louder than the wind, heavier than the hum still buzzing faint in Rusty's skull. He'd seen something down there, something alive, and they knew it without him saying a word. What the hell happened? Reese finally snapped, stepping forward, his cigarette ash scattering. His voice was sharp, but his eyes darted to the water, uneasy. Tethers cut clean. You hit a prop or something? Rusty wiped his face, salt and sweat stinging his eyes. Wasn't a prop, he rasped, throat raw from yelling into static. Something down there, big, glowing. Figures moving around it. They saw me. His words hung clumsy, too wild for the deck's grime and steel. He waited for the scoff, the ribbing. Callahan's cracked, too many dives, but it didn't come. The kid crossed himself again, muttering under his breath. Mac shifted, boots scraping, and spat over the rail. Bull, he said, but it lacked bite, more reflex than belief. Reese just stared, then yanked the headset from Rusty's gear, holding it like it might bite. The speaker hissed, a ghost of the static that had drowned him below. Radio's shot, Reese said, tossing it down. Camera 2? Rusty nodded, unclipping the dive cam. Blank tape, lens dark, no proof, just his word. The crew swapped looks, the kind men give when they want to call you crazy but can't. They'd seen the lights too, those night shift flickers no one explained. Get some rest, Reese said too quick. Decompression's messing with you. We'll sort it tomorrow. He turned away, barking at the others to get back to work, but his shoulders stayed stiff. Rusty hauled himself up, legs shaky, and stumbled to the bunk room. The hum lingered, a dull throb behind his eyes, and the dome flashed in his mind. Those figures, those masks. He collapsed on his cot, boots still on, staring at the rust-streaked ceiling. Sleep came fast, but it wasn't rest. He dreamed of the deep, the dome pulsing green, the hum twisting into a chant he couldn't catch, low, guttural, pulling at him. Faces loomed, blank and silver, watching from the dark. He jolted awake, sweat-soaked, the hum still there, fainter but real. The clock read 2 a.m., but then he heard it, chopper blades, cutting the night. He staggered to the porthole. A black helicopter settled on the rig's helipad, unmarked, sleek as a shark, antennae bristling like spines. No oil company logo, no Coast Guard red, just shadow and steel. 2 men climbed out, suits crisp despite the Gulf's damp, their strides too sure for roughnecks or execs. Reese met them, gesturing toward the bunk room, his face tight. Rusty's gut sank. This wasn't a check-in. The door banged open, and the suits stepped in, tall, one lean with wire glasses, the other broad, jaw like a slab. No names, no badges. Callahan, Glasses said, voice flat as slate. Cabin 2. Now. It wasn't a request. Rusty stood slow, his dive knife still clipped to his belt. They didn't blink, just led him across the rig to a cramped room. Charts on the walls, a table, a single bulb swaying. The door clicked shut behind them. Sit, Slab said, pointing. Rusty dropped into the chair, the hum ticking louder in his head. Glasses pulled a notebook, pen poised, while Slab leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Describe it," Glasses said. "Everything. Don't skip." Rusty's jaw tightened. "Who are you?" "Company don't send suits for a bad dive." No answer, just stares, cold, unblinking, like the masks below. He exhaled rough. "Fine. Dome, 50 feet wide, black, glowing green. Figures in silver suits, small, moving fast. Cut my tether. Gear went haywire, light, radio, all of it. They saw me, and I got the hell out." Slab didn't flinch, but Glasses scribbled fast. "Did they approach you?" he asked. "Communicate." Rusty frowned. "One got close. Looked at me, blank face, like a mirror. No words, just a hum, loud as hell. Felt it more than heard it." He tapped his chest, the memory rattling him. Glasses nodded, like it fit some checklist, then slid a folder across the table. Photos spilled out, grainy, black and white, underwater shots. Domes half buried in silt, glowing faint. Dates stamped on the corners. 65, 69, 71, all Gulf chords, all before tonight. "What's this?" Rusty asked, voice low. His fingers brushed one, 28 degrees north, 89 degrees west, deep water. Too close to where he'd been. "Classified," Slab said, stepping forward. "You saw something you weren't meant to. Happens more than you'd think out here." His tone was flat, but his eyes bored in, hard as rivets. "Sign this." Glasses pushed a paper over, non-disclosure, dense with legalese, promising jail or worse if he talked. "Means you forget it. All of it." Rusty stared at the page, the hum pulsing in time with his heartbeat. The photos burned in his peripheral. Proof he wasn't nuts, proof they knew. "And if I don't?" he asked, leaning back. Slab's mouth twitched, not a smile. "You don't want to test that, Callahan." Glasses tapped the pen, impatient, but it was Slab's stare that pinned him, dark, promising something uglier than words. The rig creaked around them, the gulf lapping below, and Rusty felt it again, alone like down there, with eyes he couldn't see. He grabbed the pen, scrawled his name, and shoved it back. The suits didn't blink, just took the paper and the photos, leaving one behind, 28 degrees north, 89 degrees west, glowing in the deep. A warning or a slip. The door shut, and the chopper's roar faded into the night, leaving Rusty with the hum, the chord, and a crew that wouldn't meet his eyes come morning. Rusty Callahan sat in the bunkroom of Pelican Dawn, the non-disclosure agreement's ink still wet in his mind, the coordinates. 28 degrees north, 89 degrees west, burned into his memory. The suits were gone, their black chopper a fading throb over the gulf, but their words stuck like tar. "You don't want to test that, Callahan." The photo they'd left, grainy, glowing, a dome half sunk in the deep, lay tucked in his duffel, a taunt he couldn't shake. The hum pulsed faint in his skull, a rhythm that wouldn't quit, and the rig's steel walls felt too close, too flimsy against what he'd seen. Morning broke gray, the crew avoiding his eyes as he hauled his gear to the supply boat. Reese barked orders from the deck, his cigarette a pinpoint of orange, but he didn't call Rusty back. No questions, no ribbing, just silence, thick as the Gulf's murk. The kid with the cross muttered a prayer as the boat churned toward Homa, 50 miles of choppy water between Rusty and the rig. He gripped the rail, the hum ticking louder, sinking with the engine's drone. Those figures, those masks, they'd cut his tether, watched him. And the suits knew. Had known for years. Homa's docks stank of shrimp and oil when he stepped off, the town a sprawl of clapboard and neon blinking through the haze. He dropped his duffel at a flop house, paid a week up front, and headed for the Rusty Anchor, a dive bar where Gulf hands swapped lies over cheap whiskey. The hum dogged him, a shadow he couldn't outrun, and his hands shook as he slid onto a stool. The barman, a grizzled coot named Sully, poured without asking. "Rough one," he grunted, eyeing Rusty's salt-crusted jacket. "Rough don't cover it," Rusty said, downing the shot. The burn didn't touch the hum. He leaned in, voice low. "Ever hear of something down there, big, glowing, not ours?" Sully's rag paused mid-wipe, and an old rigger at the end of the bar, white beard, hands like claws, swiveled slow. "Seen lights," the rigger rasped, voice whiskey rough. 10 years back, off Grand Isle. Boat went missin'. Crew gear all gone. Company said storm, but water was flat that night. He tapped his glass, eyes hard. "They're down there, watchin'. Oil boys hush it. Long as the rigs pump, they don't care what's below." Rusty's skin prickled. No proof, just bar talk, but it fit too damn well. He bought the rigger around, pried more. "Lost a diver once," the man said, staring into his drink. "Came up screamin' 'bout shapes, then vanished. Quit or got quieted, who knows?" Rusty nodded, the hum spiking as he pictured the dome, the figures. Vince's last log flashed in his head. It talks down there, scribbled before Guam went dark. He'd thought it delirium. Now it felt like a warning. Night fell, humid and thick, as Rusty walked back, the town's lights smearing in the fog. The hum grew, a drone that drowned the crickets, and he caught it then, headlights steady trailing a block back. Black sedan, no plates, creeping slow. His pulse jumped, the suit's threat echoing. You don't want to test that. He turned down an alley, boots splashing mud, and the car followed, engine purring soft. He doubled back, cutting through a lot, and faced it head-on, slamming his fist on the hood. Out! He roared, knife in hand, ready for slab or glasses. The sedan idled, windows dark, but no one moved. He yanked the driver's door empty. No keys, no heat in the seat, just a faint buzz, like the hum turned electric. The air thickened, the sound spiking, deafening, and Rusty stumbled back, head splitting. The car's lights flicked on, blinding, then off, engine dead, silent as a grave. He ran, chest heaving, the hum a roar in his ears. Back at the flop house, he locked the door, dragged a chair under the knob, and pulled the photo from his duffel. 28 degrees north, 89 degrees west, deep gulf, where the dome waited. The suits knew about Vince, knew too much, and that empty car wasn't a coincidence. He unfolded a gulf chart, hands steadying, and marked the spot with a pencil stub. The hum settled, a low thrum, almost coaxing. Go back, it said, or his mind did. He couldn't tell anymore. Sleep wouldn't come, not with the hum, not with the photo staring up. The rigger's words looped. They don't care what's below, and Vince's log gnawed at him. The suits wanted silence, but they'd slipped, left him a thread. He'd signed their paper, sure, but he hadn't signed away the truth. The gulf held something old, something watching, and it wasn't done with him. Neither was he with it. He grabbed the chart, the cord circled red, and shoved it in his jacket. Tomorrow he'd find a boat, a rig hand who'd take cash and skip questions. The hum pulsed, approving or mocking. He didn't care. He'd dive again alone and face it. Whatever it was, it had Vince's ghost, the suit's secrets, and now him. The Gulf could keep its silence, he wouldn't. 3 weeks after the suits left Pelican Dawn, Rusty Callahan stood on a rickety charter boat, the Gulf stretching black under a moonless sky. The cords, 28 degrees north, 89 degrees west, burned in his head, a spot 50 miles from shore where the dome waited. He'd burned his last cash on this rig, a rust bucket skippered by a drunk who didn't ask questions. The hum thrummed steady now, a pulse in his skull, louder each day since Homa. It wasn't just sound anymore. Come back, it whispered, and Rusty couldn't say no. He suited up alone, no tether this time, just a tank and a knife. The skipper grunted, crazy bastard, but didn't stop him. Rusty hit the water, the Gulf swallowing him cold and fast. 200 feet down, the dark pressed in, his dive light a frail spear. Then it came, the glow, emerald and fierce, sharper than before. The dome loomed bigger, its black curve alive with that green pulse. The hum roared, shaking his bones, and there they were. The figures, silver suits glinting, masks reflecting his beam like mirrors. They didn't move at first, just watched, a dozen or more ringing the dome. Rusty hovered, heart slamming, the hum forming words. You were warned. His light flickered, died, same as before, but the glow held, bathing him. His gauge spun, tank hissing, and the figures glided closer, slow, deliberate. One reached out, arms stretching thin, and the water tightened, pulling him down. Weightless, gear failing, he kicked, useless against the drag. The dome seemed split wider, green light blinding, and the hum screamed, a voice now, old and vast. Stay. Rusty's mind flashed, Vince, the suits, the empty sedan, all threads to this. His knife slipped free, sinking, and the figures closed in, masks blank, hands brushing his suit. Cold seeped through, not water, something else alive. He thrashed, lungs burning, but the Gulf held him, the dome a maw swallowing light. Days later, the charter washed up off Grand Isle, drifting empty, skipper gone. A dive slate bobbed in the wreckage, scratched with Rusty's hand. They're here. Always were. No body, no gear, just that note, salt-crusted and final. Word spread quiet, another Gulf ghost story, but the rigs kept pumping, oil flowing thick. A radio crackled in Homa, record halls, no questions asked. Down below, the glow pulsed on, silent, waiting, and the Gulf kept its deal, whatever it was.